Hello, hello. This is Rod. I have a story to tell. I thought I would share a few things. I've thought about doing this for years and I haven't really taken the time to do it. But tonight I was going through some old cards and I found a letter that I didn't even remember receiving. And this is a letter that I received when I lived in a little teeny house on 330 North, 400 East in Pleasant Grove. And I received this letter from a dear friend. His name is Channon Lill. Now, I haven't heard from him now for years. I hope that he's still doing okay. But the experience I had happened in February, about 31 years ago. And I was 29 years old. I had my wife had left and taken my babies to Colorado, and we were getting divorced. And it wasn't something that I wanted, but it was happening. And I was driving back from Salt Lake Valley to Utah Valley, and it was February. It was late in the evening, and the sun had gone down behind the mountain. It wasn't dark yet, but on I-15, that's the busy freeway here in Utah, and I was southbound going through Sandy, and I saw a man standing in the snow ahead on the side of the freeway, going southbound, as I was going southbound, and I pulled over to give him a ride and see if he wanted a ride. I figured if someone's standing on the side of the freeway, they'd probably like a ride. And I always remembered a man from the scriptures I grew up with called King Benjamin from the Book of Mormon. And he said not to let the beggars put their petitions to us in vain, because we're all beggars before God. And, ever since my children were babies, I've always been pleading with God to protect my kids. And King Benjamin said not to let the beggars put their petitions to us in vain, because we are all beggars before God, begging him for whatever things we're asking him for, or forgiveness of our sins. And so I've tried hard not to just pass people by that are in need of help. And anyways, I started slowing down to pull over. There he is standing in the snow, and he had a long beard. And as I pulled up the side of him and reached over to roll down that window, and came to a stop, rolled down that window, and he's got a long beard. And to my surprise, he was standing there reading a black book. It was actually the Bible. And before I could even ask him if he needs a ride, I didn't realize a highway patrolman had pulled up behind me and had run up and leaned down right in front of this man, leaned down into the window and said, "Give me your license and registration." Whoa, I didn't even know he was there, and then there he was, asking for my license and registration. So I pulled my wallet out of my pocket and handed in my driver's license, and I reached over to the passenger side of the vehicle to open the glove compartment. It was just a little 4-cylinder pickup I was in. And when I opened my glove cylinder, the highway patrolman saw my registration in the glove compartment, and he reached right through the window into the glove compartment and grabbed it and took it, and went back to apparently write me up a ticket. And he hadn't even told me what I'd done wrong. I didn't even know what I had done wrong. I was quite surprised, and I looked at this man, and he said, "Hey, I'm sorry." And I said, "Well, it's not your fault." I said, "I'd ask you if you want to ride, but he seems upset that I've even pulled over, so I better wait." And a few minutes later, he came back and handed me my driver's license, my registration, and a ticket. And he still didn't even tell me what I did wrong or what the ticket was for. But he was obviously unhappy, and I said, "Well, is it okay if I give this man a ride?" And he said, "Go ahead, I don't care." but it was obvious that he did seem to care. So this man got in my little pickup with his backpack and his sleeping bag, and I proceeded to drive away because I didn't want to stick around there and have that highway patrolman any more upset than he already was. And I handed the ticket to this man that I was giving a ride to, and I said, could you look at this as I'm driving and tell me what he gave me a ticket for, because he didn't even say. He looks it over and he said, he gave you a ticket for non-emergency stop on the freeway, which was kind of a surprise to both of us because, I don't know, someone's standing on the freeway in the freezing cold snow, standing on the side of the freeway. You'd think that might be emergency enough to give someone a ride, but anyhow, as we're driving away, he looked that up, and then he starts talking about Yahshua. And, he'd been reading the Bible, and I listened to him. He seemed to know the Bible better than almost any religion teacher or seminary teacher I ever had. And, many years back, I even served a mission for the church I grew up in. Anyhow, this man knew the Bible a lot better than I or anyone I knew did. It sure seemed like he did. And I asked him, I said, what church do you belong to? He said, it's not a church. And I said, well, what religion is it? And he said, it's not a religion. And I said, oh, and I said, now where are you headed? And I don't remember all the order. And he said, Denver, Colorado. I said, oh, my kids live up in Colorado. They're just babies. Their mom took them up there. And he said, well, I spend half the year in Denver and half the year in Seattle. I'm headed to Denver now. I said, okay, well, I'm headed back to Pleasant Grove. And, he continued to talk, and I took him home. And I lived at this little house at 330 North, 400 East. Teeny little 660 square foot house, but I took him in, fed him dinner. We talked for hours, and I let him stay the night there. He laid his sleeping bag down in the living room. We had wonderful conversations, and I knew that I had a holy man of God in my home. I've had other religious people and even church leaders in my home, but this time I felt like I had a holy man of God in my home. I knew in my heart that I did. And in the morning I fed him breakfast, and I later in the morning I took him back down to the freeway so he could head on his way to Denver. And I asked him, and this was back in, when would that be? 1992? February of 1992. I think that's correct. 31 years ago. Yeah, I think that's right. Anyhow, and maybe it was 30, maybe it was 1993. But I asked him, I said, how do I ever get a hold of you? Because this is before we had cell phones, right? And he said, well, you can send a letter to general delivery to the Denver post office. And isn't it interesting? Later, I find this letter that he'd sent me. Channon Lill, general delivery, Denver, Colorado. It was the post office. And he'd written me a letter later, and which I found now, again, I guess 30 some odd years later, and I'm so grateful for it. But what ended up happening is about 5 months later, in the middle of the summer, in July, the heat of the summer, if I remember correctly, I get a call late that evening, and one evening, and he says, Rod, this is Channon Lill. And I'm sure I was so excited to hear from him because I knew what kind of man this was, and I really believed with all my heart that he's a holy man of God. He was 33 years old. He'd forsaken everything to follow Yahshua, Jesus Christ, and had quite an impact on my life. And when he called me several months later, he said, Rod, I have another man with me, and two other ladies with me that do what I do, and I'm wondering if we could spend the night in your home. And I had asked him on that previous visit, when I said, where do you live? He said, well, we find homes that are boarded up. We'll find out who the owners are and ask them if we can live in them while we clean them up for them. And that's when I said, well, so there's others that do what you do. And he said, there are. I said, are they all men? And he said, no, some are women. I said, are any married? He said, some are. I said, do any of them have children? He said, some do. So here he was coming back 5 months later, told me he had another man that does what he did, two other ladies, and he asked if they could spend the night in my home. Well, I'm pretty certain he knew that they were welcome in my home, because these were holy people of God that I would never have to wonder if they would steal anything or do any harm in any way. I just felt so strongly that he was a holy man of God. I knew with all my heart that he was. And so they came, and this teeny little house, 660 square feet. I mean, that's one of the smaller homes in all of Utah. I'm sure it's in the smallest 1 or 2% of homes in the state. And it was a 100-plus-year-old house, I guess, and somewhere around 100 years old at that time. But they'd already eaten dinner, so I couldn't feed them dinner. And they said they'd already eaten. And they tied a string up on 2 little nails between the living room and the kitchen to divide it. And they put a sheet over that string to divide the living room from the kitchen. And the 2 young ladies put their sleeping bags down in the living room. And the 2 men put their sleeping bags down on the other side, one in the little teeny kitchen. There was only room for one sleeping bag in there besides the table and a couple of chairs, just a little table and chairs that were there. And then the other one put his sleeping bag in the little hall going to the back door. And then there was one bedroom where I slept in my bedroom. And then I had there was a little lean-to going next to that back of the hall that had been added to the house, 6 by 9. And that I had, a lady helped me wallpaper that, a lady at church, from church, helped me wallpaper that and turn that into a little bedroom for my kids. When they'd come, we put 2 little toddler beds in it and a teeny dresser. That's all there was room for. And anyhow, they slept that night in my home, and in the morning I fed them breakfast. And it was just amazing having these people in my home. And the young lady wrote a letter, asked her if she could write a letter to my ex-wife, and at that time said the Lord still viewed her as my wife, and would I give it to her? I said if she's receptive, but I didn't think she'd want it. Umpteen years, 20 years later, when I finally remarried, my wife found that letter and asked what it was. I said, oh, that's that. I told you about those people, and they wrote that letter, and I ripped up the letter at that point and threw it away. But the day that they were there, something that impacted my life even more happened. They invited me to forsake everything and to follow Yahshua with them, to live for Yahshua, to sell everything, just to forsake everything. And it reminded me of the young man who said to Jesus Christ, Master, what do I need to do to inherit eternal life? And he said, keep the commandments. And the young man said, I've done this since my youth. What lack I yet? And Christ told him, sell all you have and give it to the poor and follow me. Well, the young man turned away sad. The scriptures say he turned away sad because he had great possessions. And in other words, he was wealthy, kind of wealthy. And here I was, 2,000 years later? Almost. Living in one of the smallest homes in Pleasant Grove, and I'd become a certified appraiser at that point and thought I was going to make a good living and get wealthy. Well, I never became real wealthy. I made it, but I never owned any big homes or new cars, lived within my means, and bought things used. But I've been, always strove to be honest in my work. I've made lots of mistakes, but done things wrong, broke all many commandments, but I am trying to follow God and Jesus Christ, even though my faith wavers at times. But it had such an impact on my life. And to find this letter today, because I've told people this story, and let's see, where is that? Not used to doing this kind of backwards here, but there is his name, Channon Lill. General Delivery, Denver. Oh, he impacted my life, and I read this letter tonight from him too, and really inspired me. What a wonderful man. I did send a letter many years later, but I never got a response. He maybe wasn't there anymore. Who knows? I mean, it was over 20 years later when I finally sent a letter, but I was so grateful that time that he came back with those others. I've had some amazing experiences in my life, and that was definitely one that impacted my life. So he set out to live for Jesus Christ, Yahshua, as he referred to him. And I'm sure he's had an impact on a lot of people. I'm just one of them. And I knew where he'd forsaken everything as the Lord said. And I saw a humility with him. And in fact, when we went into the little home that I was renting at that time, and he brought in his backpack, his sleeping bag. He had some type of an apron on under his coat. He had jeans on, blue jeans, but he had an apron on that I don't remember it, but it hung down below his groins. And I said, "What's that apron?" And he said, "Oh, this is made by some of the ladies that do what I do, and they make this just for modesty." So he had a pair of jeans on, but that covered the whole groin area and a little lower, just for additional modesty. And yeah, I'm very grateful to have met him and the others that were doing with him what they did in trying to live for God and Christ, for the example that they were to me and to others. So I'm grateful. This is Rod. I'm Rodney deJel, and had an impact on my life. I hope sharing this with you might bless you in some way. So this is Rod, and have a wonderful day.